Welcome everyone to DRJ's webinar series. I'm Bob Arnold, President here at DRJ. We thank you for your attendance today and we hope you gather some great information from today's webinar. Everyone's phone has been muted and we ask you to utilize the question panel you'll find on the right hand side of your screen. Our speakers today will attempt to answer as many of these as possible at the end of today's session. Today's sponsor is Bluelock, and today's topic is the best practices for leveraging DR as a service to achieve your IT disaster recovery objectives. Our speakers today include Naveen Chhabra and Pat O'Day. Naveen serves infrastructure and operations professionals, delivering strategic guidance to Forrester's vendor and end-user clients. He helps enterprise develop and execute cloud strategies, as well as design and deliver the services that I&O professionals must enable to support the BT agenda. His research coverage includes cloud services, IT automation, and service management. Pat is Bluelock's Chief Technology Officer and is responsible for commercializing and making the company's disaster recovery as a service cloud computing model a business reality. With nearly 20 years of experience as an information technology professional, he defines Bluelock services, spearheads its strategic vendor alliances, and oversees the solution strategy. With no further introductions, I'd like to welcome and turn the mic over to Pat.
Hey, thanks, Bob, and hello, everyone. How are you today? Just want to go through the agenda at a really high level to make sure that everybody understands the perspective that we're coming to this webinar with. So Naveen is going to cover from the analyst perspective on modern disaster recovery, walk through IT versus BT resiliency, and some of the steps you can take organizationally to basically move from the traditional model over to the resiliency model. And then as a cloud provider that focuses on disaster recovery in the cloud, I'm going to talk about some of the options that you have out there in the space, how they work, things to think about, and how to map that strategy you come up with that Naveen talks about over into a platform if you choose to outsource the model that you use. So real quick, just to help set our frame of reference, we're going to ask you to take a poll question and try and figure out, with this particular group, we talk about this material a lot and everybody has a little bit different flavor. What are the biggest challenges in your organization or for you personally with trying to get to a true, more resilient model with IT disaster recovery? One of the things we see a lot, go ahead and answer the poll questions if you will while I talk. I'll just do a little bit of voiceover on the different options and some things that we've seen, but not just are we experiencing this in reality, but statistically we've done some research and figured out that there's a really significant mismatch between the business expectations and what the capabilities of IT are. That's probably not a surprise to those of you on the call. The other thing that we're seeing is that IT is having trouble keeping up with how fast infrastructure and applications are changing. Cloud is certainly driving a lot of that, but so is outsourcing to software as a service, that and all the security incidents that are coming. Budgets have remained relatively flat, so trying to get more with less is still a challenge. And a lot of folks are being asked to tackle things that they haven't done before, or maybe they've experienced one time. Disaster recovery is a great example where if you've never been in a disaster, it's hard to be an expert. And how do you bring an expert on your team and get that advice? And then, focus and priority. Disaster recovery always seems to be number 11 on the top 10 things list to do when you get challenged.
Wonderful. Looks like we've got most of the folks voting, so I'm going to go ahead and publish the results here. Close it. And then we'll share it with the audience here. You'll see tied actually for first. They're both limited budget and mismatched business expectations with IT capabilities, followed up by in third place, can't keep up with changing infrastructure and apps, followed by not enough time for it or not enough resources, and finally needing expert advice. So I'll go ahead and close this and hide it and move on with today's presentation here. And Naveen, if you'd like to take over from here.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Pat. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining from. First thing first, I want to start off with what we hear as customers' expectations today. Whether you're a consumer, a citizen, a patient, a client, whether your firm sells to individual customers or to other businesses, customers today have increasing demands of uptime. Whether your business suffers from a fire outbreak, a complete blackout, or whether your data center is submerged, or whether your firm faces cyber attack, your customers expect you to ensure that services are ever available. The customers' demands are, on the uptime and the availability are ever rising. It used to happen in the past that customers would be understanding if there is any downtime because of extreme weather or flood or hurricane or fire. But come today, the customers don't care whether your services face downtime because of internal or external reasons. Internal factors could be like human errors, like the patch management, which possibly triggers a downtime, or a hurricane or a fire incident or something like that. They really don't make any distinction anymore, and they expect that in today's digital age, a mature firm will take advantage of the technology that is available and will create the kind of resiliency that will help you to continue to operate through any of those disruptions. That's their expectations, and as organizations, if you don't meet their expectations, you basically undermine your brand, the trust the customers have in your brand, and subsequently it becomes much harder to win new customers, serve and retain them. That's a completely different set of customers' expectation as we see today. On the same lines, we see the partner expectations. If you're a large enterprise or a small and medium-sized business, oftentimes we see that you have dozens and maybe sometimes hundreds of market relations. These could be strategic suppliers, go-to-market partners, and so on. These providers, these partners, and your businesses are quietly tightly knit today in terms of business. So much so that, if anytime your businesses are, your services are down, your partner's business and services are also down, and vice versa. Let me take an example of, say, an e-commerce or a marketplace provider. If you're a marketplace provider, if your services are down for any reason, none of the marketplace players can perform business transactions, and that impacts everyone. So partners along the same lines have come to similar expectations as your customers would today have. In fact, the other thing we see globally is that there are increasingly regulatory compliance around third-party risks. Auditors, whether they might be internal, industry, or government, they expect you to perform due diligence and a thorough assessment on your individual capability, on your partner's capability, from business continuity, from disaster recovery, operational and security perspective, which allows you to continue to operate during the possible disruptions. And you have to prove that to these auditors that you have performed due diligence. And in most cases, your partners would do the same upon you. The next group of people who expect the services to be always up are the business stakeholders. These are the ones who you are working with as your partners, as your customers, or maybe external agencies. Your business stakeholders have high expectations of you, whether it's a finance team which is doing modeling, which is doing sales and revenue forecasting, or if it is your design and engineering team developing new products and services. You in the IT organization are delivering these services to the businesses that help them perform their job on a daily basis. In fact, in one of our surveys, we asked the respondents on what is the single most lasting impact or damage 6 months after the disaster. The number one thing which the respondents voted for was employee morale. So you think about it, particularly for us in IT, we're constantly trying to prove our value back to the business and be a trusted partner. And if we have any major outage or a disruption, which we cannot recover quickly from, it will seriously impact the relation on a longer term basis and simply deteriorate the trust with these business partners. So the business expectations are huge as well. These are some of the changing demands as we see in the marketplace today. In my one-on-one discussions, I often find folks say that, it won't happen to me. We have built resilient services. I always tell them to think again. According to the last Forrester and DRJ's joint survey, we found that 1 out of 3 firms have actually declared a disaster in the last 5 years. Go back in 2010, the statistics were like 1 in 5. And overall, 31% of the firms say that they have never declared a disaster, which was 36% in 2010. I was also referring to a list of the disasters. I think there is some problem in the screen sharing. Give me a sec, please. Okay, I hope the screen is visible to you all now.
It looks all right.
Great. So I was referring to, one of the lists which maintains the latest disasters or the outages which have been called out. And each quarter, the list looks worrisome as, most of the big trusted brands in the Fortune 500 or Fortune 1000 list have not been left untouched by these outages. And that causes significant dent in the customer perception and causes damages to the brands. Now, investing, if you look at the reasons why businesses would invest in the business continuity and disaster recovery capabilities, it is to mitigate the risks. It is again from one of our surveys. We find that the respondents believe that the level of risk is increasing, and the risks are inherent to the increased reliance on technology for all the critical business operations, as we bring in more and more process level automation, if you will. As the businesses demand real-time action inside, the applications are getting highly interdependent, interconnected on a real-time basis, and the possibility of a single IT element, failure of a single IT element causing a major outage, I mean, the risk of that is very high. Recently, let's just take an example of what happened in the past 10 days. A router backup failure in case of Southwest Airlines, it trickled the whole business services to go down. Besides that, if the businesses are vulnerable to, say, security attacks, despite spending millions on the security infrastructure, such cases do happen. And that's yet another, the third reason why businesses are investing in disaster recovery capability, because they find cyber attacks as one of the other reasons. Not so long ago, Sony has been a known case, of such an attack. I did in the initial part of my presentation, I did talk about these mega disaster causing reasons, but it may be tempting to blame some of those large scale disaster that would have either occurred in the past, something like Hurricane Sandy, the Japanese tsunami, but when we go back and ask our customers and the respondents on what are the top reasons of the disruption in your business services, we find that the operational reasons are the top in the list. I don't feel good to be picking on someone, but just to highlight the fact that these are the mundane failures that affect your ability to continue to operate. Let's just look at in the last 6 months. all the major airlines in the United States have had some or the other failure, be it JetBlue, Southwest, or just yesterday it was Delta. It was the operational reasons which led to the downtime and not the disasters, natural disasters. AWS data centers have gone down a few times. The last was in Sydney for 6 hours just because of power failure. Skype services have been down for a few hours because of an error induced by a change in the network configuration. However, let's look at the fact which remains that all of us as businesses have to plan for all these incidents and the vulnerability reasons, which may differ from one form to the other. But the fact remains that you have to plan for all the possible reasons which could be the leading reason for the disasters in your firms. Now, if you look at the macro scenarios, the risk and the business continuity expectations and the demands which your businesses and partners and everyone else have, you need to be moving from the notion of building disaster recovery capability to the notion of being resilient. To highlight what I mean by being resilient, it's the ability of a firm to deliver on its brand promise no matter what the disruption. So all the kind of disruptions we've talked about have to be covered up and ensure that the business services are continuously available to all the stakeholders, whether it's a customer, partner, or whosoever else. And as I propose to pivot to the notion of resiliency, here are the key differences I would like you to understand and to ensure that you understand and bring the notion of resiliency into your organizations. So the raison d'etre of business is to serve clients, and the investments to increase resiliency are driven by the need to serve client and not to be seen as an insurance policy. If you look at the table here, that's one of the key difference. And focusing on the BT resiliency, that's business technology resiliency, it's a significant shift from the thought where the business continuity leaders would say, what do I do when my services go down, to how can my software design ensure service resiliency? So here it starts from the very first stage of your application lifecycle, and that's design. As a business leader, as a technology leader, you're then thinking about how to mitigate risks. You would be thinking about all the possible risks and take proactive steps to reduce the impact from, say, hours or days to minutes and seconds. Needless to say, learning is a continuous process, and it's applicable to make sure that the feedback loop serves to make continuous improvements to ensure that the continuous availability of these services is emphasized. It's just so very timely. Last Friday I was in an inquiry call with one of the global majors in transportation industry on the ways in which they can build resiliency into their systems, because their businesses come with an expectation of no downtime. I recommended them a left shift to achieve resiliency, and that is on the same point where I said the applications, the resiliency has to be built into the application, not just expected at the operations level. All this is good, but I'm sure all of you have a common question in all your minds. It is about, Naveen, how do we do it? How do we get there? So here I have outlined a 3-step process to the business technology resiliency. It starts with the resiliency lifecycle, which is a comprehensive cycle, and we shall discuss about the important steps and the ingredients of this lifecycle. The other clarity I want you to build is about measurement of availability. It is as the way your business would, and it is relatively very simple. But most technology owners typically fail to understand it the way they should. I'll quickly talk about that as well. And then the next is about mapping the right set of technologies to your business objectives. The very first step, as we talked about, is the resiliency lifecycle. And it starts at performing the business impact analysis, if you will. And the business impact analysis deals with identifying the critical business processes or the business functions. And for each of these business processes, you would be typically working with the business stakeholders to define the recovery requirements. The business impact analysis, and through that, you would also determine the relative criticality of all the business services and map all of their resource dependencies. As I was talking in the initial part of the presentation, that applications are in a complex environment, and they depend upon each other for a particular service to be made available to, whether it's a partner or a business partner or an employee within the organization. It also, the business impact analysis also quantifies the possible cost of downtime and determines appropriate recovery objectives. The next step in the life cycle is risk assessment. Enterprise risk assessment groups would typically drive the risk assessment, and they would focus on operational risks. The resiliency team should run risk assessment, focus on the technology risks, and these two are different. I'll quickly touch upon these two as well. Now, purpose of the risk assessment as a step in this life cycle is to identify the risks, analyze them, evaluate them, and treat them. Business continuity and resiliency professionals would focus on treatment efforts and would prepare response plans on the most probable highest impact risks. The third step in the life cycle is strategy and plan development. The business continuity teams will develop business prevention strategies and develop detailed action plan and put all those detailed action plans in place. The resiliency team, that's the technology resiliency team, they would be focusing and they would be responsible on the technology imperatives. The response plans, if you will, must ultimately roll up to the business continuity plan which your organization would have. Now let me just take few examples to highlight what is meant by the business continuity and the business continuity and the business continuity team and the technology resiliency team. So here comes an example of building a system with N+1 redundancy, if you will, whether it is on the compute side or the storage or the network. At an infrastructure level, it could be multiple power grids, connecting through the multiple power grids, or building up sourcing redundant network from the telco providers. The plan development in this step details who is going to take an action, when the person is going to take an action, why would an action be taken, and how would that action be taken in case of any disaster. So if you will, complete RASI of the actions is defined in the strategy and plan development stage. The next step in the life cycle is planning, testing those plans, and maintenance. Now, I would be using a very strong statement. It's, if you are not testing your plans are basically useless. So the teams here in this step would be exercising and testing the preparedness and validation of all the plans which have been developed in the previous step. The testing process helps you identify any gaps or issues either in strategy or in specific response plans. Finally, they are all effective means of training the employees in their response, in their responsibilities and roles which they would be serving at the time of a disaster. These plans must not only be thoroughly exercised, but they also need to be kept up to date to reflect the changes in the business operations. If any of the plans is out of date, they will basically hamper your recovery efforts, either during testing exercises or during the real disruptions. Now, all the 4 steps here have models or templates, which you can take help from in building for your respective organizations, and we can help you with each of those. Looking at it, by virtue of the depth of each of these stages, most firms, as we have found in our research as well as through the inquiry calls, most firms take this life cycle as a one-time activity and find it hard to imbibe it as a continuous improvement process. And that's where the trap lies, where most of the plans fail as those resiliency plans are not updated with the change in the business processes. Now, in the last slide, you heard me talking about various different roles, different people, and I'm going to place all of them as various stakeholders and bring clarity to that. Basically on a single pane. So the first and foremost in any organization are the business executives. You have the business executives who are interested in retaining or improving the brand image. These are the people who do not want their firm's name to be highlighted in the news next morning. Typically, these are the CIOs, who would provide the executive sponsorship for investment. From our surveys, we find that 78%, almost around 78% of the business continuity teams, they report into the C-level executives. So, that shows the focus almost all the organizations have, from a business continuity perspective. On the same lines, for large enterprises, firms have another set of people who are typically the business unit leaders who have interests in ensuring that their specific business within the organization continues to run predictably and no gotchas. You'll work with these stakeholders to build the scenarios for each business unit and the way that the disruptions would be handled to ensure continuity to their part of the business. The next category of the stakeholders is the security and risk management office. These are people who would want to cover all potential risks at an organizational level, not just at a business unit level. And they would want to be as comprehensive, being a risk officer, they would want to be as comprehensive as they can. And they would be developing all those scenarios. They would also be developing the risk mitigation strategy, and that's where you have to be, as technology teams, you would have to be a partner to the security and risk management office. Last but not the least is the technology management team that's kind of responsible for building the technology solution for all the possible risk mitigation strategies across all the identified and planned risks. Ironically and incidentally, most businesses assign the resiliency ownership to the technology teams, and to begin with, I mean, they would be considered the people to start, and that becomes one of the reasons for an incomplete or not so strong resiliency capability, because the rest of the 3 stakeholders are never consulted. All of these, and one of the recommendation here is all of these stakeholders would never be in sync all the time because of their competing objectives. The risk management team, so say for example, would want to cover all possible risks on the earth, but the business executives will be constrained by the amount of money they can spend for all possible risk mitigation strategies they come up with. And this will influence the prioritization of identified risks and the investments thereof. Now, one of the key consideration of risk and the business impact is the cost of downtime. Just to highlight, as we find that it's perceived quite often that the cost of downtime is equal to the lost revenue. If we dig a bit deep, cost of downtime is not just equal to lost revenue, but it is multiple more elements which the business executives and the business unit leaders would take into consideration. it's the responsibility of the business continuity teams to basically apprise the executives of all the possible cost impacts. I was just reading through, the impact Delta Airlines would have, sorry, Southwest Airlines would have as an impact, impact of their services unavailability. They're going to give vouchers and discounts up to the extent of like 50% of all the travel which the customers, which their guests have not been able to take. So consider like $10 million of lost revenue, additional $5 million of discounts which they would have to offer to keep the customers in good books, right? So that's the kind of impact which any organization would have to face. Here is, as I talked about, the prioritized list and tiers of applications. Here is a sample classification, which the businesses and the technology management team, in fact, all the 4 stakeholders collectively would come up with. And at your organization, this list could be different. You could have 4 categories, 5 categories, or maybe just 2 categories. So take this classification as just a sample, as a guide. And all it wants to highlight, the sample list all wants to highlight, is the fact that you would not want to invest in building a 5-star capability for a 3-star application. Since I've been talking about as these have been in the fashion last few months, let me just take examples from that. Baggage handling application probably would not afford to be in the platinum category. Frequent flyer application, claims, probably they may not even qualify to be in gold category. They would probably qualify in the silver category here. But the check-in application, if you will, would have to be a platinum class. And each of these class of services would have corresponding recovery times, recovery SLAs, and so on, and would also identify what technology can be used to achieve those recovery SLAs. As we see, the natural or man-made causes can bring significant losses to the business, and the downtimes are typically very unpredictable. It's highly unlikely that one would be able to predict the exact time and the loss and the impact an organization could have. And keeping that in mind, when we survey the respondents specifically on their intent to upgrade the business continuity and disaster recovery capabilities, around 2/3 of the respondents tell that it is a critical or a high priority. While it is such a critical or a high priority, but the executives are not willing to spend extra dollars to increase their resilience capabilities, or even if they're willing to spend additional dollars, that's very minimal. As you can see from the graph here, only 30% of the respondents say that in their business continuity disaster recovery capability there's hardly any increase, and the budgets are kind of lying flat. The second step, as I was talking about, is around the availability, and I wanted to kind of bring this picture in front of you to highlight what, as technology management teams typically would think and would plan around, is at the time the outage occurred, the IT sometime after that, my apologies, I don't know, for some reason it was not showing up, but I hope it is visible to you all now.
It is, Naveen. It's looking okay.
Okay, so as we were talking about, around the availability aspect, the technology management team typically are focused on bringing up element by element, system by system, and calling that as an achievement against the recovery SLAs. So that's typically, the second bullet here. That is where the ITO, the IT teams think about, recovery time objectives. But think through, as I, in one of my first slide, I was talking about technology management teams have to think about availability from the customer, from the business user's perspective, which is that if the users are not able to execute their business transactions, not able to follow through the processes, that's where the challenge is. Okay, the next step, which is a step number 3 in the whole life cycle, it was about matching the objectives to the right mix of technology. So if you look at the whole process, the life cycle which any businesses would take, they would have a matrix of the cost and the recovery objectives. There are tons of technologies available. If you want to spend, you can possibly spend more, but you want the application resiliency to be measured in seconds, it would have a higher cost impact versus some application which can possibly face a downtime of say a few minutes, but can come at a reasonable cost level. One of the possible service models here is disaster recovery and as a service, and this is where we would focus on the next few slides. The typical situations the business would face and would fall towards supporting investment into the disaster recovery as a service is first and foremost is the cost. As we just talked about, the business executives are not willing to spend extra dollars. Cost becomes an imperative for the technology management teams to be looking at priority number 1. So in situations where you have the technology management team have the capability to spend only limited budgets, the disaster recovery as a services come in very handy, because very low one-time cost, if at all there is. Very few providers charge, few DRaaS providers just do not charge any one-time cost. The second expense is operational expense, recurring cost. It is typically pay as you go. And it also provides, as part of that cost, providers also provide failover testing assistance. As I talked about in the previous slide, that testing your plans frequently with every possible change is very important. And that's where the DRaaS services come in very handy to serve your requirements. And the next one is flexible short-term contracts. Most of the DRaaS providers, would ask you to get into a contract, but typically much shorter than the contract you would have gotten when engaging with the managed services provider. Theoretically, you have an advantage to switch contracts, but please also note that it's easier said than done. DRaaS providers have been very successful in delivering to the virtualized infrastructure. So if you have applications which are on the virtualized infrastructure, there's a quick value in consuming the DRaaS services, and yet delivering at a much lesser cost back to your business and achieving those SLAs. The next important element which I want you to focus on is skill augmentation. With the invent and ever-improving technology, most of the firms find that it's kind of challenging to improve and continuously innovate because of the people capability to learn new technologies. DRaaS providers are in the business of offering these services and can drive significant skill augmentation. I also want you to focus on the areas where DRaaS would probably not be a fit. In case of status quo, you have existing investments which you cannot come out of because of long-term contracts. Maybe you're running legacy applications which are tied to a particular infrastructure, tied to physical boxes, and coming out of that is very tough. DRaaS services would not be a good fit. The next is network bandwidth. I don't think I need to explain on that, but because the bandwidth which the replication technologies would require would demand a much higher network bandwidth. And if you're operating in a particular city or a council where you don't have much higher network bandwidth, this could be a bottleneck. The next is, which is very less talked about, but consider it as a very important element. Think about a DRaaS provider who may claim to be a leader in a particular city or a particular state or a particular geographical region. Depending on just that, would be a very strategic misfit, as in case of a disaster, all the clients will actually run up to that provider, and that provider typically would not have all the resources to serve all the clients in case of a disaster in that city or a location. With that, I know I've kind of spoken at various elements within the whole strategy, with the technology and so on. The only things which I want to leave you with is that don't start with technology. This is one of the common mistakes across organizations, that people start to approach with technology. And that can lead to the mismatch between the business expectations and what you can deliver. And hence, first and foremost thing would be to work with your business and application owners to define the recovery objectives and the SLAs. The next is about identifying the gaps in the resiliency coverage, and start with few workloads, and this could be a quick testing ground for you. The next is about people capability, the culture, and so on. It's about establishing a culture of excellence and continuous improvement, as I also referred to in the last few slides. One of the things which drives people behavior is incentive, and inculcate the culture across teams, across individuals, with incentives, with their key performance metrics, to reflect a commitment back to resiliency. With that, I'll pass it over to Pat.
Great, thanks, Naveen. All right, so in the spirit of Naveen's advice, I am not going to start with technology, although we will touch on that at a high level for those of you that are curious how DRaaS works and how it might be different than the approaches you've seen over the last decade. There are two ways to look at an implementation in DRaaS, and this is the super simple one. This does tend to focus on technology. This happens when we work directly with the IT organization and not the business continuity or the executive team, and they're looking at this as a technology purchase. Basically, they'll do what we call a really light BIA, gather some requirements about the amount of infrastructure, CPU, RAM, and whatnot, and then figure out for each application what IT thinks the RTO and RPO needs to be, and then how do you build a playbook around different recovery scenarios that might be required in different situations, and how do you take that over into an operational plan to make sure that the data continues to replicate and that you're testing on a frequent enough basis and touching all the right things that are important to the technologist. In reality, what we know and what Naveen is telling you is, and what you probably already know organizationally in your own world, is that there are a lot more teams that have stake in resiliency. So the technical team is really myopic in the sense that they focus around IT systems availability and uptime, and they're looking at DRaaS as a way to either more cost effectively or at a higher quality, or something to basically outsource a portion of the technology part of the program. So they're going to drive cost, the coverage across different types of systems. They'll care a lot about what tools are used so that they're familiar with how that works, and they can be comfortable. We work a lot with executives and increasingly board members. The board is applying a lot of pressure on leadership teams, mainly driven to security incidents, a lot of the data breaches that have occurred. But as Naveen mentioned, as you start to dip into what's happening to some of the airlines and some of the other cloud-based systems that are out there, the outages that are caused to applications, that's all getting folded in together in a heightened risk management and diligence view from leadership, trying a top-down approach. When we work with business units and oftentimes the end customers of our clients, we're running into people that have an increasing dependency. So if you think about an application like Salesforce.com, the customers of Salesforce probably care about their availability because their sales teams are less effective or ineffective if the application is not running. So we get into the combined conversations there, but it always drives down a specific application and how it impacts a specific business function. The other thing that we see is that as the level of risk is increasing and awareness and whatnot, is that third parties like auditors, insurers, and regulators are starting to get involved. As those folks come in, they have a little bit different view. They require proof. Sometimes that's a matter of just a sign-off test completed by both sides, both parties in the testing protocol, or in some cases they actually need to be sitting there watching the recovery test work, or they need a report that goes much deeper into how the system's actually responded. So what you see is that we can take that high-level approach I showed earlier where it's really just about technical requirements, or we can actually dive into a little bit more of what we call a prolonged BIA, where we do a pretty standard BIA where we work with all the executive stakeholders or all the stakeholders in the project to drive requirements in each of those 4 groups. Then we move into, based on those different scenarios, what would the risks be depending on different application scenario outages, different types of outages, whether it was security or a systems crash or a developer doing an update that went wrong. And then how do you drive that into an actual solution that might support those different scenarios efficiently from an economic standpoint. And the funny thing about this is everybody talks about getting disaster recovery and they talk about testing. And the reality is that those 2 things only represent about 5% of the time you're going to spend living with the solution. The other time is just operating it and making sure that it continues to run and continues to protect the business. It's like talking about insurance, and you only talk about it when you have a car accident or when you actually negotiate what your deductible will be. The reality is the greatest value comes from when it's running all the time. And then once you figure out what that process is going to be like, how you're going to handle change management, do both companies have ServiceNow, and you need to integrate those together? What does that look like? And then how do you take it into the implementation phase to make sure you can onboard it quickly? That may have to do with lots of data you have to move. It may be teams that have to be trained. It may simply be the fact that you've never had disaster recovery like this before, and you're just trying to learn how to manage the control panels. So one thing that we talk about is there is the technology play. You do have to tie these 2 infrastructures together and make sure they're compatible and they move data back and forth. And then the DRaaS site will resemble production effectively enough during an event, so you continue business operations. But the other piece is how do you take all those components and all those constituents I talked about and make sure that they get the specific things that they need to feel like the confidence in the solution will work. So we talked a lot about the technology teams, and they care a lot about onboarding. They care about the playbook, the run books, testing, cost, infrastructure. If not all of your environment can fit in the cloud, how do you support those hybrid architectures? And then what types of expertise might you be able to get from the DRaaS provider if you don't have that on board your team today? And it could be a matter of just training the trainer where you leverage the DRaaS team for a period of time until your team becomes the experts with the solution. Executives and board members, business-centric approach. They care a lot about the service level agreements. They want some teeth. They might want some additional insurance protection in case the solution doesn't work or doesn't come back. How do they get visibility and documentation so that they can share that amongst themselves or to anyone that they might need to offset the risk? They need proof, but usually in the forms of paper. And then when you look at business units, they want to know that not only is the technology going to come back, but what about my application? And what place in line am I compared to the other business units in the company? And they're going to be people that support me directly, or am I going to be standing in the queue? And by the way, what happens if the IT team that I depend on isn't available because they're impacted by disaster? Can I reach out to the DRaaS provider directly and get my recovery performed? Auditors, insurance, and regulators obviously require a lot of documentation. Sometimes they need to come in and validate the environment, but in, again, a lot of cases, they need all the things that you would typically need in an audit scenario, but from a DR perspective. And then if you're managing sensitive data, which almost everyone is today, a lot of the regulators say, that's great that you've got DR, I think it'll work, but that is a whole other environment that's sitting out there vulnerable to intrusion. How are you securing it? How are you protecting the sensitive data at the DRaaS location? So some lessons learned we're going to walk through. We've got something we call true RTO, and this is one of those, I guess it's a warning, but also it's a pretty positive thing if you think through it. And those of you that have been around continuity for a while will already understand this, and you'll see how this all pairs together. But one of the things we run into when people talk about DRaaS is they, again, take a technology-focused approach, and they talk about how quickly can the technology come back. And we all know that there's a lot more going on than just the technical RTO. There's all this other process that needs to go on in terms of QA and whatnot to figure out what the actual RTO is that you'd be able to commit back to the business, to the executives, to the auditors, or to the application-specific shareholders. So we built this little picture here to help you see. So you've got, technology today in the DRaaS environment can come back, in as little as 15 minutes. It's actually pretty amazing leveraging cloud and some of the modern software that's out there. But by the time you validate the environment, do the QA, do all the communication, check in with all the application owners, you can see there's all this stuff that needs to occur. And we find that a lot of times people will set the RTO expectation around here, and vendors are guilty of this. This is a bragging point for vendors in most cases. But in reality, this is what you want to communicate. And you can see if you've promised this, and you have an event and you end up over here, that can be a pretty significant mismatch. So let's walk through some DRaaS platforms out there, and we'll talk a little bit about how the true RTO actually fits in. So Bluelock has 3 different platforms today, and you'll recognize these. We've got a run environment for always-on applications. We have ready, that's for near standby, and then we have restore, which is more of a backup as a service. So if you take the traditional parlance, hot, warm, and cold, or cool, we have each of those 3 platform environments. And I'll go ahead and open up a little bit of a diagram to walk you through each one of these and how they're different from each other. So in our hot environment, what you're able to do is basically have your production environment here. And typically we see application replication occurring. So if you have SQL servers, you have Exchange, you have Oracle, you might have Active Directory for identity. It's really the application itself doing the replication, even though the target site is a cloud platform. And why people do this in the cloud is because you can typically scale the amount of infrastructure you need. So if you have a Microsoft Exchange environment or a SQL database that normally has 4 CPUs and 64 or 128 gigs of RAM, the target site can actually have a much smaller environment, maybe 1 CPU and 4 gigs of RAM, because it's only supporting replication, even though it's technically a hot site. And then when you have an event or you do testing, you literally just go in, and through the software you can scale up as many CPUs and as much RAM as you want, and it will function, as big as, or possibly even larger if you need it, than the production original requirements that you have. The other model we have is the hot and warm model. So this is Bluelock Ready, and what it means is you've got a fully running production site here. You're replicating data typically at the hypervisor level or somewhere underneath the application. It could be an agent inside of the operating system, but it's moving data over to a system that is just storage. It's literally just keeping a replica of that application or that virtual machine. There's no CPU, there's no RAM, there's no software licenses, there's nothing assigned to it. So you're really just maintaining the cost here, and then when you scale, you go up into this side on the cloud and you pull all that stuff in. A lot of people call it rehydration. So you rehydrate the environment. The technology can do that in about 15 minutes, but what we're seeing again is by the time you put the process on top of it, in most environments, that can take it to an hour or longer in terms of what the RTO can be. And then the final model we have is the classic cool or cold site. We call it cool because it's a little bit faster than a cold model, but you basically, because the disk storage is online all the time, even though it's archive class. So the difference here is you have your hot site running, and instead of replicating through the hypervisor or an agent to a always-on system storage here, you're actually replicating over archive class storage. And the difference between production storage and archive class storage is the performance. So this system may have a massive amount of capacity, but it's more like a backup system. It's really not meant to actually serve applications up in real time. So when you actually declare what happens is this storage needs to get promoted up into the production environment, and that takes a little bit of time. So the RTOs tend to start at 4 hours and be even greater, even up to 24 hours, because this system is just so slow. And the primary driver here is these are tier 3 applications that they need some form of recovery, but they don't have to be back in minutes, much less hours. So one of the other things, we've been doing disaster recovery as a service for quite a while, and one of the things we started to run into is scale. So I'm going to talk a little bit about recovery waves. And recovery waves is basically a way to take a technology tier, let's say the Bluelock run environment, you've got all these applications, maybe 100, maybe 200 applications that require an RTO, true RTO of 4 hours or less. You need to be able to set expectations, because we can bring that technology back super fast. In 15 minutes to an hour, all those applications can be powered up that you've got classified in tier 2. The challenge is when you add the QA, communications, et cetera process, you start to spread it out, and the technology ends up running faster than the humans. So how quick can your team actually log in, check applications, make sure they work, make sure the security is in place, et cetera, so on, before moving to the next application set. So you may have a 4-hour model here, but in reality, when you look at what the recovery process would actually take when you involve people and process, you may want to stack those applications out. So the final thing we'll talk about is, in a DRaaS environment, it's really important to see how much intelligence and automation the provider is going to offer you through the power of their software. So just a quick peek at our control panel, you can see that on a per application basis, you can actually go into your environment, see what the recovery health is. So in other words, what's the likelihood that it will actually recover? Is the replication up to date, RTO, RPO, all that? Is it in cost alignment? So did that environment get bigger and nobody knew about it, and now it's costing more than it was when you originally started? You got an alarm going off there. And what's the testing frequency? If you set a schedule around 6 months, but it's been 8 months since it's been tested, and you can tell you've got a problem there. And as Naveen said, it may not even be worth trying to recover that environment because you haven't tested it in a while. If you're looking at it from a RACI standpoint, this is an extended team between you and your provider. So you've got, who are the members of the team that are on the Bluelock side or the DRaaS provider side, and then who are the folks that are on your team, and what are the roles. Recovery playbook, so you always have a latest or greatest copy there. It does you no good if that playbook is stored in your data center where the actual disaster occurred. And if you need to show testing history to an executive team, a board member, or an application owner, or it should even show a certified result, you should be able to pull that certificate down at any time. And then this is just an expanded screen that digs into a little bit more detail. As you click in, shows what your health is on a score, and based on different components that make up that score, you can get a test scheduled if you want to run through that. You're within your testing threshold here. You can see when that's been set, and you can see what is actually driving your cost into the red there. And then little things like security, are you using encrypted or unencrypted storage? That helps you if you're trying to appease an auditor. So with that, we'll open it up for questions, Bob.
Wonderful, thanks. Thanks, Pat and Naveen. We do have time for about 1 or 2 questions here. First question, what questions should I be asking potential disaster recovery providers?
Yeah, I'll take that since it sounds like Naveen's either on mute or he'll wait for me to go. So I think the biggest thing is what Naveen said, and that is to try and understand if you don't have a good feel for what your requirements are. DRaaS is new, so most people haven't used it before in the real world. So one is, do you need the provider to help you dig through and figure out what the requirements are, or are you already in possession of a shopping list and you're trying to get alignment done as soon as possible? So I think that's the best place to start, is do you need help figuring that out or not?
Yeah, I think I would also I would echo that statement and put it a little differently, which is about asking your provider if the provider has consulting capabilities to take the your business through the entire life cycle of understanding what the recovery requirements would be, identifying what SLAs would make sense, and also provide the technology options, to match those SLAs. Referring back to one of my slides, not all applications would require a common SLA. It would vary by the application, and having a spectrum of capabilities to serve across all those platinum, gold, silver class of requirements. I think that would be yet another requirement which you should be asking your provider to help you on.
All right, we'll have one more question here we'll try and get to. What's the best process to align the various stakeholders in our availability and get everyone on the same page?
I think, as Naveen mentioned, that requirements gathering process, I think you can find out very quickly. We had a company talk to us yesterday, and they said that IT was leading the project because they're aware of how high the risk is based on their current environment, and they've invited stakeholders from all the different groups Naveen and I mentioned, and they're getting very lukewarm participation. So one of the things you can do is identify what the risk is going to be. We often see that if you lead with a classification of applications and a recovery time that you as IT believe is the right answer, and you ask people to sign off on that it gets a higher level of participation. So I think finding a way to engage those other audiences is really key, just based on whether it's coming from you as a department or whether it's a top-down strategy.
So if I were to take that question, my experience tells me that it would almost always be a top-down approach. And to get your executives to sign up on and commit to your proposals, you can't say that, here is a $2 million requirement and I want to build a disaster recovery resiliency capability for. You would have to turn it around and say, look, here are the risks, potential risks we are facing. Here is the potential impact of each of the risks, and here is a risk mitigation strategy for each of these identified risks, and here is the expected investment for risk mitigation. That is where you would find a much higher acceptance level, and acceptance has to start at the top. The other element which commonly binds all the stakeholders, it may be one person, it may be 5 different people, or 20 different people, is incentivization. That works wonderful.
All right, wonderful. We are to the top of the hour, actually past the hour, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up today. If we did not get to your questions here today, Pat and Naveen will have access to these questions following the webinar, and we'll follow up with you directly via email. So any parting words here today, Pat or Naveen? Pat, Naveen?
Oh, I didn't have any parting words other than it's never too late to get started.
All right, well, perfect. Thanks again for everyone for your attendance here today. We again hope you gather some great information from today's webinar. DRJ would also like to thank Naveen and Pat for their time here today, as well as Bluelock for sponsoring today's webinar. We will be emailing everyone a link to the recording of this as well. You may view it as frequently as you wish or share it with your peers. If you do have any additional questions, please contact Disaster Recovery Journal. Thanks again, and this now ends today's webinar.